In this video, I will present how fast Schwarzenegger's physique got reduced after he said that he was going to quit competing in bodybuilding. However, first I will show what he looked like off-season. Taking into account how drastically the shape of today's bodybuilders can differ, one could assume that it was similar with Arnold, except that we don't have any materials from that period. It turns out, however, that it wasn't quite like this, and one of the reasons were completely different standards when it comes to the cut level of contestants. Looking at this photo from 1968, one may as well go ahead and say that this is the off-season shape. Arnold is big and full, but you certainly wouldn't call him cut. In later years, he would obviously develop better and better definition and separation, and looking at this photo from a workout in 1969, one could really see a huge difference. It looks like the bulking period in its fullest, and one could say that it is the most spectacular shot of Arnold off-season. The gigantic mass combined with obscure details of muscles is impressive. It is the photograph that could make one most confident that he wasn't in the startup period here. Moving on to 1971, the beach photo also suggests off-season, great fullness, and not so perfect cut. 1974 is an analogous situation where the refinement and sharpness that characterize the startup shape are missing. Now let's go back to 1971, and it looks like off-season here, despite sporting more details on his thighs than on the stage in 68. So other than that, there was no spectacular difference in appearance here. Off-season, he was simply a little bigger and a little less cut, but the character of his physique remains similar. Last but not least, one of the least favorable shots, at the beach next to Frank Zane. I didn't find any info about what year it is from, and thus about whether he was an active bodybuilder at the time or not anymore, but it is very possible that it is one of Schwarzenegger's worst dispositions off-season, and definitely one of the far from best shots. From the beginning of his career, Arnold kept competing continuously until Mr. Olympia 1975, and then he announced that he was done competing. Now he presents the stage materials from his last Mr. Olympia at the time, because after that, as I already mentioned, he returned in 1980. Just around a year later, in 1976, he looked as you can see on the screen. First and foremost, he is no longer so jacked and gives the impression of having some air let out of him. However, it is not his best photograph, and in the other ones you can see that he was able to maintain a clearly above average amount of muscle. Taking advantage of the fact that a whole photo shoot was done of the downsized Arnold at the time, one could compare him in several different poses and see what kind of changes took place within around a year. In the biceps, on the front, he was able to maintain the most mass in his arms. It seems that his back suffered the most here, which truly lost a lot of its width. Of course, his legs and chest shrunk too. He is overall smaller, less hard, and not so separated. At lower level of subcutaneous tissue, he would be more cut in the photo on the right, but at the same time smaller. Here is a combination of more or less his front pose, where he seems to have maintained probably the most quality. Sure, all of his elements got shrunk and he is less cut, but his chest is still pretty impressive. He also still has his round shoulders. Looking at the comparisons of different poses, on one hand, the 12 months was indeed enough for his physique to lose some points, but on the other, we won't see some drastic detransformation. What is more, if we were to only look at what he looked like in 76, he can still be pretty impressive. Above all else, like I mentioned before, with the quality of his arms. It would be interesting to look at the number here and how many pounds he lost, but I haven't found that info, so I will have to settle for the visual changes. Let's move on to the year 1977, which means it's been 2 years now since he ended his career. A pose with a slight twist of the torso, where the greatest changes involve the central part, which is the chest and stomach. The arms and shoulders have shrunk too, but it isn't quite as visible as the previous elements. Here we have another favorable shot, differing very little from the last year's 1976. These, however, were the bright sides of the shape of 77. Stretching arms using the upper pulley rope, where you can truly see the major decrease in sizes, above all else the fullness of chest again. Comparing this specific photo with the best moments of his career truly shows a huge shift here. Now in a non-bodybuilding and non-gym pose, based on which it would be difficult to guess that not so long ago, he looked like this and was the best bodybuilder in the world. And finally, the photo everyone was waiting for. At first glance, it looks like a complete detransformation of physique, but when you look more carefully, you can see a huge arm and even a slight outline of abdominal muscles. Either way, this photograph was taken 2 years after he won Mr. Olympia. An enormous change that proves that Arnold was and still is a regular human being, and when he didn't put 100% commitment in building his physique, he presented a normal appearance. This photo shouldn't mislead you, however, because this shot of his shape is also from 1977, and it does look very impressive. We also have materials from 1979 with a shape, say close to that in the photo with the hairdryer, presenting kind of a dad bod with a lot of muscle mass but also coated with quite an amount of subcutaneous tissue. Which means this is what Schwarzenegger looked like after 4 years of not having to prepare his physique for bodybuilding competitions. Who knows what he would have looked like after a few more years without strong physique stimuli, but this was also when the tide had turned due to the requirements of his acting career. Arnold returned to training due to being cast as Conan, and at the same time he decided to surprise the entire bodybuilding world by getting his 7th title of Mr. Olympia. As he said himself, he only had 8 weeks to get prepared for competitions, and yet he was able to regain so much of his former champion physique that it allowed him to beat bodybuilders who hadn't taken any breaks for the past 5 years. Of course, it's a whole another issue that most people believe that he clearly didn't deserve that win, and he only owed his triumph to the IFBB politics. There is no doubt that the 1980 version was smaller and not as refined as those from his best years, as confirmed by a glance at the comparative materials. On the other hand, when looking at what he looked like in '79 and that in 2 months he got himself back into a great shape, it shows the incredible power of muscle memory. Later years brought him different acting roles that required him to be of the appropriate disposition. The 1975 to 1980 period could be considered a decline, which wouldn't be repeated for a long time after that. Even in the much later pictures from the 90s, he showed a truly good physique. In the modern materials, he obviously looks the way he looks due to his age. We also shouldn't let edited photos that use Andreas Kallen's musculature mislead us.